Hello, welcome. We're just going to give people a minute to join here.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Aidan Kraus, and I use they, them, theirs pronouns. I'm a second-year doctoral student at BU, and I have one of the research assistants for Project Avant, the study which we'll be presenting to you today. I identify as white, European, US American, transgender, genderqueer, currently able-bodied and lower middle class. I have short brown hair, green eyes, and I'm wearing a green, blue, and white checkered shirt. My Zoom background is a black and white view of some buildings on the Boston University campus. I have the privilege of opening up our webinar for you today, elevating the voices of transgender and non-binary adolescents, promoting strengths and resilience. Unfortunately, I will be needing to log off the call after providing the introduction, as I have another in-person conference presentation that is starting shortly that I was unable to reschedule, but we're going to jump right into it now. So in today's webinar, we'll first provide a brief overview of the research focused on experiences of gender diverse youth, and then turn to our study, Project Avant. We will close with some implications, and then open up the webinar to questions and comments from you all. So before we kind of get into things, I wanted to go over some terminology. This slide has a picture of a whiteboard with words saying, hello, my pronouns are, in rainbow font. And since we're going to be specifically focusing on certain identities today, we wanted to take a moment to review terminology for those who might be new, and a refresher for those who might not. So gender diverse youth are those who have different gender identity than their sex assigned at birth, including binary identities. For example, transgender women, transgender men, boys and girls, and non-binary identities, including genderqueer and gender fluid. And this term is used as an overarching term to describe people who don't identify with their sex assigned at birth. Cisgender youth, conversely, are those who identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth, and make up most of our population at this time. There's also a range of different identities and expressions under the gender diverse umbrella. However, the two that we'll be focusing on today are transgender and non-binary identities. So transgender youth identify with a gender identity that is different than the sex that they were assigned at birth. And this includes those who have both and or socially transitioned and medically transitioned. Non-binary is a term that people use to describe their gender identity when they do not identify as either male or female, and is seen more as gender fluid and on a spectrum. So why are we doing this work? Historically, we know that gender diverse youth experience health disparities. In regards to mental health, research has shown that rates of depression, suicidal ideation, and suicide attempts are higher than cisgender adolescents. A national survey that came out in 2022 found that transgender and non-binary youth were 2 to 2.5 times more likely to experience depressive symptoms, seriously consider suicide, and attempt suicide compared to their cisgender queer counterparts. Further, gender diverse youth have a greater likelihood of substance use and earlier age of onset of substance abuse. For example, findings from a study in California found that gender diverse youth were roughly 6 times more likely to use cigarettes, 3 times more likely to use electronic cigarettes, and 5 times more likely to report heavy episodes of drinking. Both of these issues are essential given their significant health consequences. Protective factors. So despite some of these disparities, not all gender diverse youth experience negative mental health symptoms or engage in risk-taking behaviors. School connectedness, non-discrimination policies at school and state levels, relational support, including family support, and gay straight alliance school groups have been shown to be forms of protective factors for this community of young people. However, the research has focused mostly on a deficit perspective opposed to a strengths-based perspective. To conceptualize our findings and how we're viewing the research, we're using a minority stress as well as a minority strengths model to conceptualize these disparities and protective factors. The minority stress model was originally proposed to explain psychological distress and risk-taking among sexual minorities and was extended to gender diverse individuals who experience increase in extrinsic factors of stress, which can also be seen as discrimination due to their marginalized identities. The model indicates that environmental and psychosocial factors at multiple levels impact this population. And in terms of the minority strengths model, it was developed in response to the minority stress model as a framework for identifying strengths among this group and to promote resilience and well-being and overall health. And the model incorporates individual level strengths as well as system variables while initially being developed for the use in the LGBTQ greater population, but has since been extended to gender diverse individuals and youth. Gaps in the current research. This slide has a picture of a middle school age adolescent who is white presenting, has short blonde hair, has pink and purple eyeshadow. Further, the individual is looking up to the right with their hands on their hips, and they're wearing a navy t-shirt with the words "Love Who You Are" in rainbow font. Most previous research on gender diverse youth has drawn from a deficit perspective, as I mentioned before, as opposed to a strengths and resilience perspective. And research on protective factors has come from cross-sectional study designs and primarily from medical clinic populations. Additionally, information on this population often views gender diverse youth as a homogeneous group with a lack of exploration of subgroup differences among this population, as well as a lack of understanding of how intersecting identities are also impacting their experience. And based on the gaps in the current literature, we launched Project Avant, which Dr. Green will now take the lead on describing. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Aidan. And thank you all for joining us here today. I'm Jennifer Greif Green. I'm a faculty member at BU Wheelock. and I use she, her pronouns. I identify as a white, cisgender, heterosexual woman. And I'm going to be talking today about our methods for the project and describing to you the background of the study and our study procedures. So as Aidan mentioned, our project is called Project Avant, and Avant stands for Advancing Voices of Adolescents Identifying as Nonbinary and Transgender. As you'll see on the left of the screen, we have our Project Avant logo, which looks like an A and a V next to each other, and it has those same words right under the logo. We have a website, which is projectavant.org. It's spelled Project for project, and then Avant is spelled AVANT. And this project is in collaboration with a number of faculty and students mentioned here. Melissa Holt, who'll be speaking briefly, myself, Katie Perotti, Sabra Katz-Wise, Aidan Kraus, Tanvi Shah, Lindsay Ranker, and Ziming Shen. And I know some of them are on this call today, and I'm really happy to have you here as well with us. This project is a collaboration between researchers at Boston University in the College of Education and researchers at Boston University in the School of Public Health and at Boston Children's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And the data we'll be presenting today were collected between December 2020 and February 2021, so during the pandemic. And as Aidan mentioned, there are several unique contributions of Project Avant that we want to make sure to highlight in this webinar. First, the data were collected online and our sample was recruited using social media methods, and that is different from most other studies. As Aidan mentioned, most other studies have collected data either through a clinic-based sample and specifically for clinics serving gender diverse youth, or in large national anonymous cross-sectional surveys. So if you're familiar with the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance Survey or the YRBS, it's an anonymous survey that goes out to youth in schools. But because it's anonymous, it's not possible to follow youth over time. So what's unique about Project Avant is that we're collecting data from youth broadly using social media strategies. So not only youth who are arriving in clinics and receiving care and healthcare, we're also able to access youth who are not receiving care related to their gender identity and perhaps who don't have the support or permission of their parents. And we're also able to collect data over time longitudinally. So we're following youth over multiple time points. Our study, as Aidan mentioned, is also focused on health and well-being and school experiences. And we're explicitly integrating questions about strengths into our study. And one unique part of our study that I wanted to also highlight is that our study data were collected with a waiver of parental consent from the Institutional Review Board. So whereas most other studies have required parents to consent for their youth involvement, we have youth assenting, so agreeing on their own to participate, which means that we're able to collect data and voices from youth whose parents may or may not be supportive of their identity or of them participating in a research study. Our data were collected, or participants were recruited using Facebook, social media influencers, and Instagram. So the slide shows 3 images for Facebook, social media influencers, and Instagram. Most of our data were collected from people who accessed our information via Facebook and Instagram. We did contact social media influencers, but they weren't the main source for our sample. To put together ads to post on Facebook and Instagram, we partnered with Karen Morales at Marketing Magnet. And this is an example of the kind of ad that she developed for us. And so this is a picture of a hand with a flag, a rainbow flag painted onto the hand. And the text says, "Seeking transgender teens whose sex at birth was assigned male." And that's because we were specifically recruiting particular groups of youth. And then it says, "For a confidential 15-minute online paid study." On this next slide, we have a video that was put together by Marketing Magnet. And I'll play the video in just a minute, but the video will show you a variety of different teens and their images, and they'll be walking and moving through the images. And then there's text related to our study. So I'll read to you the text as we go through. There's also music that will play in the background. Non-binary 14, 17, So youth were directed to our website, and this again is our website. If you click on our website right now, which is projectavant.org, it will say that our study is closed and not accepting new participants. But when we were actively recruiting participants for the study, there was information about the research study, resources to contact, frequently asked questions, our contact information, and then a link to enter into a survey. And what we put on this website was a screening survey, which helped us to determine eligibility for the study. So we wanted to make sure that participants who participated in the study fit the criteria of what we were looking for, and I'll describe that in just a minute. Over 2,700 individuals entered our website through these media ads and submitted an online screener. So we specifically selected people who responded to that screener and said that they were between the ages of 14 to 17 years old, that they were living in the United States, because we decided that this would be a United States-based study, and who self-identified as transgender and or non-binary. So if people met those criteria, we would send them a baseline survey. 314 people completed both the screener and then the baseline survey, and we paid each of those people $15 in a gift card for their completion. And then of those, 62 were excluded based on the validity screening that we conducted, which left us with a sample of 252 participants at wave 1, which was the initial wave of our study. On this slide, we're showing the screening criteria and eligibility criteria for the study. So the first eligibility criteria is age, and there's a symbol there of people of different ages. And the age range again was 14 to 17 years old. The next criteria was gender identity, and there's a symbol there for gender identity. And again, youth had to identify as transgender or non-binary or both to be eligible for the study. Below that is our validity checks. So we conducted a series of validity checks for the study. And then finally, location, which has a picture of the United States, that youth needed to be living in the United States. So to pass the validity checks, we looked at correspondence in answers to questions on the baseline survey and the screener. And we looked to see that a number of things were consistent across the two surveys that we would expect to not change between the screener and the baseline survey. So we looked at self-reported age and whether that was consistent across the two time points. And as another example, we looked at state and zip code and whether that was consistent across the two time points. We also looked at whether the survey was completed in at least 5 minutes. We had a number of people in our research lab complete the survey, and it always took much longer than 5 minutes. So we wanted to make sure that people had spent at least 5 minutes on the survey. We made sure that people completed at least a majority of questions and that they used an IP address that was located in the United States. Our assessments assessed a series of sociodemographic characteristics. And on the right here, there's an image of a middle school age child who is wearing a rainbow sweater and has a rainbow flag painted on their cheek, and it is hanging on what looks like a hammock from a tree. So we assessed a number of sociodemographic characteristics such as gender identity, age, race, ethnicity, religion. We asked a series of questions about gender affirmation and where youth were living in their affirmed gender identity. We asked questions about social and medical transition related steps that youth had completed or were interested in completing. We asked about mental health and health risk behaviors such as symptoms of anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, perceptions of family, school, and community connectedness. And then we asked a series of open-ended questions, and Melissa will present some of the data from those open-ended questions. And we gave youth the option to respond either by writing out text or by submitting an audio file. And I wanted to specifically discuss our data collection about sex and gender. And on the right-hand side, there's a photo here of a protest, and there are people holding up signs, for example, a sign that says "Protect Trans Youth." So in our study, we asked participants to indicate both their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity. And we asked these questions based on recommendations from the Williams Institute and other researchers who are doing research around gender identity. Youth could select multiple gender identities, and they could also choose to enter their own gender identity into a box of each wave of data collection. For the purposes of the analyses that we are presenting today, we group participants into 4 categories, which represents one way of summarizing or approaching the data. And the 4 categories that we'll be presenting to you today are female and transgender, male and transgender, non-binary and assigned male at birth, and non-binary and assigned female at birth. And this slide shows the demographic characteristics of the sample. So the average age of youth in our sample was 16.7, so about 16 and a half years old. In terms of gender identity, again, we required that they self-identified as either transgender and or non-binary, and about 60% of our sample identified as transgender, about 50% as non-binary. Of course, that adds to more than 100% because many youth identify as both. We have the data here on race and ethnicity. About 85% of our sample identified as white, about 16% as Hispanic or Latinx, about 7% as Black or African American, and 7.5% as American Indian or Alaskan Native. And youth who participated in our study came from 43 states, and they were pretty evenly distributed across different regions of the country. About 14% from the Northeast, 30% from the Midwest, 27% from the South, and 29% from the West. I will turn it over to you, Melissa, now to explain what we found.
Thank you, Jen. My name is Melissa Holt, and I'm a faculty member at BU's Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. I use she, her pronouns and identify as white, European American, cisgender, heterosexual, and currently able-bodied. I have shoulder-length brown hair, blue eyes, and I'm wearing a cream top with a black sweater. My Zoom background says BU Wheelock and has grayed out images of buildings on BU's campus. As Jen noted, I'll now be presenting some of our findings from Project Avant, with an emphasis on baseline findings, though I will mention a few important results comparing participants who completed both the first and second surveys. First, I will provide a snapshot of mental health, substance use, and trauma exposure for our sample. Second, I will turn to a consideration of protective factors at multiple levels of the social ecology that we assessed as potentially reducing the mental health and substance use disparities that Aidan highlighted earlier. On this next slide, and Jen will change the slide here, thank you, percentages of adolescents reporting each indicator of functioning are provided. Among participants overall, 58% reported depression, 57% indicated non-suicidal self-injury behaviors, 46% were classified as having probable PTSD, and 77% reported anxiety symptoms. In terms of substance use, in the past 30 days, 30% stated they had used alcohol and 20% indicated they had vaped. These percentages are consistent with those found in past research, both in school-based studies and those from gender clinic samples, and again highlight the striking rates of mental health concerns, in particular among gender diverse youth. To note, one of our initial questions in Project Avant was the extent to which we could successfully retain our sample over time, given the dearth of longitudinal studies on broad samples of gender diverse youth. Our initial goal was to retain participants over 2 waves, though now we have expanded this to 4 waves. Importantly, the percentages shown here on the slide did not vary between transgender and non-binary youth who completed the Wave 1 survey only versus who completed both Wave 1 and Wave 2 surveys, suggesting that the functioning profiles of those adolescents who stayed in the study were not different than those who chose not to complete the second survey. However, participants who completed surveys at Wave 1 and Wave 2 were more likely to identify as non-binary and less likely to identify as transgender female, and were also more likely to have a female sex assigned at birth. Thank you. As Aidan mentioned earlier, to date, limited research has explored whether there are differences between gender identity subgroups. To that end, this slide shows a graph presenting rates of anxiety, depression, non-suicidal self-injury, and post-traumatic stress disorder for non-binary assigned male at birth, non-binary assigned female at birth, transgender female, and transgender male participants. In terms of indicators with statistically significant differences among groups, you will note that the transgender males, whose percentages are reflected in the yellow bars, and non-binary female at birth, assigned at birth participants, whose percentages are represented in the purple bars, reported more non-suicidal self-injury and PTSD symptoms than non-binary assigned male at birth and transgender male participants. And again, this highlights the importance of better understanding subgroup differences within gender diverse youth. As noted previously, not all gender diverse youth experience more psychological distress than their cisgender peers. Central to understanding reasons for this is better understanding factors at multiple levels of the social ecology that protect gender diverse youth from heightened rates of deleterious functioning, with particular attention to systems that already support or could be modified to better support well-being. Today, we will be presenting some initial findings on 4 factors: social transitioning at the individual level, social support at the interpersonal level, and at the contextual level, support from communities as well as the school context. This slide shows information on social transitioning and mental health. Research from clinic-based samples has indicated that gender diverse youth who socially transition, that is, change their name, gender expression, pronouns, and name to align with their gender identity, report fewer mental health symptoms than gender diverse youth who have not socially transitioned. For instance, gender diverse youth who can use their chosen name are less likely to report mental health concerns, including suicidal ideation and behavior. Further, findings from a study that included authors from local researchers at the Fenway Institute and Mass General Hospital indicated that social transitioning in adolescence versus adulthood was associated with less substance use, and specifically less marijuana use. In our study, and as shown here, we asked participants how often they lived in their affirmed identity. Here, the graph displays findings related to the amount of time transgender participants spent in their affirmed identity and their rates of depression and non-suicidal self-injury. For depression, the difference between those who spend most or all of their time in their affirmed identity, shown in light blue, as compared to those who spend some or none of their time in their affirmed identity, shown in dark blue, trends towards statistical significance. That is to say, living in one's affirmed identity was associated with fewer depression symptoms, but not different non-suicidal self-injury symptoms. The graph on the right considers findings from transgender females only. Here you will note there are more striking differences in depression rates, whereby 62% of transgender females living in their affirmed identity most or all of the time reported depression, in contrast to 79% of transgender females living in their affirmed identity some or none of the time. Taken together and consistent with past research, social transition can confer mental health benefits, though notably there are often barriers to adolescents' ability to socially transition. While we did collect quantitative survey data on supports, we also wanted to hear directly from participants about what the most central supports in their lives are and ways in which others could support gender diverse youth. To that end, we asked participants the 2 questions on this slide, and they were typed in their responses or had an option to upload an audio. We asked, in your life, which people, if any, would you describe as most supportive and why? And what can individuals, groups within families, schools, and communities do to best support the well-being of transgender and non-binary youth? Detailed findings from this qualitative study were just published in the Journal of Adolescent Research, with Tanvi Shah, a doctoral student collaborator, as the lead author. As a brief summary, the vast majority of participants responded to both questions and provided detailed responses. The average response to the second question, for instance, was 55 words. These open-ended survey questions were examined using modified consensual qualitative research, which allows systematic analysis of larger samples of qualitative data. There were 3 primary coders, and following initial coding, additional team members discussed findings and came to consensus. Next, I will highlight key results based on responses to the first question. On this side, you'll see that the majority of participants, roughly 3 and 4, shown in circles with 3 of the 4 circles filled in, stated that friends were a central source of support. As one participant, a 17-year-old non-binary Asian, white, Hispanic individual noted, "My friends are the most supportive. I talk to them every day, and they are always there when I need them or need any advice or any sort of support. I'd known them for years, and they were so supportive when I came out. I always feel I can rely on them and be myself around them." Participants also shared that their friends were the first people with whom they discussed their gender identity, and also provided specific ways friends were supported, such as by engaging in advocacy efforts on behalf of the participants with teachers, other friends, and family members. The role of partners as potential supports for gender diverse adolescents has not been extensively explored to date. However, approximately 1 in 4 Project Avant participants indicated that partners provided valuable support. And at times, given the nature of the relationship, there was an added layer of intimacy and support. As shown by the quote here, support can take on both emotional and practical forms, with an 18-year-old trans male white participant indicating, "My fiance, because he is there for me through everything, comforts me, wants to help pay for my transition, and take care of me after top surgery." Participants also noted that having partners who validated and/or shared identities with participants made their relationship feel like a space, in which one participant noted, "They can just see me for who I am." Research to date has supported the salience of family support for gender diverse individuals. This was echoed by Project Avant participants, of whom 1 in 3 indicated family support was important to them. Some participants discussed support from immediate family members, with a 17-year-old trans male white participant stating, "My mom does her best with everything, and with my consent, just casually mentions if it, my gender identity, is important to the conversation with people. She talks about it like it's no big deal, and it's great." Other ways in which family members were supportive included advocating for transgender non-binary rights and serving as strong allies in the face of transphobia. 7% of participants specifically mentioned extended family members as being supportive, particularly when support from immediate family members was lacking. For instance, a 14-year-old trans female white participant said, "My grandmother is the most supportive. She buys me skirts and cute tops, whereas my parents forced me into jeans and such." For Project Avant participants, support from communities came from a range of sources, including online communities, mental health professionals, and in-person communities. About 10% of participants named some type of community as playing a supportive role. The participant's quote here highlights ways in which online connections can confer benefits. The 17-year-old trans female white participant revealed, "My online friends are the most supportive. My school friends know I'm trans but don't respect it. They use my dead name and still treat me the same. My family doesn't support me being trans and says it's against my religion. My online friends, who I've known for about 4 years now, are the best. They were super supportive when I came out to them, and they support me through everything." I would like to next turn to a few findings related to the school context. Given the significant amount of time adolescents spend in school, it is essential to understand the ways in which school contexts can support well-being broadly and among gender diverse adolescents specifically. In this first slide in school context, findings from a quantitative analysis are presented. These come from a 2022 Journal of School Psychology manuscript on which Katie Perotti, a doctoral student member of the team, was first author. We know that school connectedness is important for adolescents in general and associated with academic and psychosocial functioning. Less research has addressed the role of school connectedness for gender diverse youth specifically, nor has explored whether the impact of school connectedness varies by gender identity. What we found is that overall, school connectedness was associated with fewer anxiety and depression symptoms and a lower likelihood of clinically significant depression. In other words, when transgender and non-binary adolescents were in schools in which they felt connected, they reported fewer mental health symptoms. School connectedness was not, however, related to non-suicidal self-injury or PTSD. Importantly, what the graph on the right shows is that gender identity influenced the association between school connectedness and anxiety, though it did not for other mental health indicators. What you will note from the graph is that for all groups, except for transgender females, who are represented in the green line, as school connectedness increased, anxiety decreased. This was most pronounced for non-binary adolescents with a male sex assigned at birth. Further research can illuminate why these differential patterns emerged. Findings from the qualitative study echo the importance of school context in which youth feel connected and supported. As indicated on this slide, 7% of participants highlighted school staff as being key supports in their lives. One 15-year-old female and non-binary white Hispanic participant said, "The most important person in my life is my school counselor. She has accepted me from the beginning and helps me with everything I need." Gender sexuality alliances, sometimes called gay-straight alliances, have been found to be related to well-being, though primarily for sexual minority youth. In our study, we did not find an association overall between the presence of a GSA and any of the mental health indicators. However, we did find that gender identity moderated the association between the presence of a GSA and anxiety. Specifically, for non-binary assigned female at birth and transgender male participants, the presence of a GSA was associated with a slight decline in anxiety. For non-binary assigned male at birth participants, however, there was a slight increase in anxiety for youth who reported their school had a GSA. The lack of a consistent pattern across subgroups may be in part because gender identity is not always a central point of discussion within GSAs, and thus may not be meeting the unique needs of transgender and non-binary participants. Further, in our study, we only asked about the presence of a GSA rather than participants' involvement in it. The final results I would like to present are on school non-discrimination laws. Based on information from the Movement Advancement Project, we created a dichotomous variable that reflected whether participants lived in a U.S. state that prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And on this slide on the right, you see an image of the United States with colors indicating the extent to which each state has an equity index. Past research has been limited on the experience of adolescents, but one study by Watson and colleagues in 2021 did find that state-level protections were associated with victimization and some types of substance use. We extended past research through focusing on mental health. The results did not indicate that students in states with non-discrimination laws reported fewer mental health symptoms. That said, we did have a small sample size, and the measurement of determining state-level protections was limited. And thus, we hope to investigate this in a more comprehensive way using a larger sample of gender diverse participants. To summarize, consistent with past research, our findings highlighted the salience of protective factors at multiple levels of the social ecology, indicating that in family, school, and community contexts that offer care and support, there is a benefit to mental health. We need then to take these findings and hear from gender diverse youth about what systemic and other changes could be made to improve the key contexts in which youth are embedded. As such, for implications, we start with and center our participants' perspectives and recommendations. This first quote offers a number of recommendations. I'd say that overall, families and schools need to be more educated on transgender and non-binary subjects. If my family would have known a bit more about what being trans is, then my whole coming out experience would have gone a lot smoother. Also, I feel they need to normalize being transgender and non-binary. This can be done by learning to automatically ask someone's pronouns when introducing yourself, or by being open-minded and accepting towards other kinds of gender expression. Similar sentiments are echoed in this next set of participants' comments, who have recommendations including more gender-neutral bathrooms would be nice. Educate everyone, including cishet students, about LGBT plus history, along with ways to support LGBT plus history. More education about how to do things like binding safely, and respecting pronouns. And note, these quotes are shown in call-out figures on this slide. Respecting pronouns was one of the most common recommendations offered, along with gender-neutral bathrooms that are not only available, but easily accessible. For example, not having only one gender-neutral bathroom in a very large school building. Participants also advocated for listening and learning. Listen to what we have to say. There is a difference between hearing someone and actually listening. Learn. Providing and actually paying attention to resources is such a big factor of being supportive. On this final slide of quotes, similar themes emerged along with a few new ones. And Jen, you can advance the slide here. Oh, yeah, thank you. Advocacy was mentioned by a number of participants who recommended speaking out against transphobia and actively pushing against discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation. The importance of access to therapists and support more generally were also highlighted. And one participant simply suggested, just listen to us and treat us normally. Therefore, our key recommendations may look similar to the traditional academic list, but in this case come directly from the gender diverse youth who generously gave their time to participate in the study. Our recommendations are simple. We recommend individuals, families, communities, policymakers, and more listen, educate themselves and others, ensure safe and supportive contexts for gender diverse youth, and serve as advocates. On behalf of my co-presenters and the project team more broadly, I want to thank you for attending the webinar today. I also want to, before we turn to questions and answers, thank the participants of Project Avant, who have so kindly shared their perspectives and voices. We will now turn to those Q&A period, and we also encourage folks to reach out to us directly via email, which are provided on the screen. My email is Holt, HOLTM @bu.edu, and other emails are also provided here. And people are welcome to reach out with any questions. So thank you, and we will turn it over to questions and comments now.